The autumn wind tasted of rust and endings. It swept down from the black hills, carrying fine red dust that settled into the cracks of every boardwalk and the lines around every eye in Dusty Creek. Eliza Hart felt it on her tongue, a grit that even water from the clinic's well could not fully wash away. From the window of the small medical station, she watched the town exist in a haze of its own making. The smelter, owned by Silas Crowther, coughed a perpetual plume of gray smoke into the otherwise brilliant blue sky, a constant reminder of who fed the town and who owned its soul. The creek that gave the town its name was little more than a muddy ribbon, its water level falling with the town's morality, or so her late father would have said. The Reverend Hart had seen the world in clear terms of right and wrong. For Eliza, now 21 years old and having seen more broken bodies than her father ever saw saved souls, the lines were blurred by that same red dust. She lived by his code of duty, but her dreams were her own. They were simple dreams, of a small house with a sturdy porch and rafters that echoed not with sermons, but with laughter. It was a foolish, private hope in a town built on the fever of gold and the promise of the coming railroad, a promise that sounded like the whistle of a distant, hungry beast. Her hands, smelling of carbolic soap and lye, were seldom idle. She worked under the tutelage of old Dr. Mallory, a man whose cynicism was as deep as his skill. He had taught her to set a bone, stitch a wound, and, most importantly, to see the story a body told. Today, the town itself was telling a story. One shouted from the saloon and whispered over laundry lines. A mining convoy, one of Crowther's, had been ambushed in the Canyon Pass. The whispers said Lakota, the shouts said savages. May, the widow who ran the town's only respectable boarding house, brought the news along with a pot of stew. Her face was grim. They're saying every man was killed, their wagons burned. Silas is offering a bounty for every Lakota scalp brought in. Dr. Mallory snorted, not looking up from cleaning his spectacles. Crowther would offer a bounty on jackrabbits if he thought it would make his gold cheaper. Never let a crisis go to waste. That's the man's motto. Eliza felt a familiar coldness seep into her bones. She had grown up here, on the edge of the great Sioux Nation. She had seen the Lakota from a distance, proud people who came to trade, their faces like maps of the land itself. She could not reconcile that image with the bloodthirsty creatures from the stories now spreading like wildfire. The story gained a face late that night. The clinic door burst open and two grimy miners carried in a boy, no older than 15. He was pale, his breathing shallow, a dark stain spreading across the canvas of his trousers. He was with the convoy. One of the men gasped, his voice thick with coal dust and fear. We found him in the rocks, the only one left. Put him on the table, Dr. Mallory commanded, his weariness vanishing into a sharp focus that Eliza knew well. Eliza, get the laudanum and boil water, lots of it. For the next hour, the small clinic was a world of focused action. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sharp tang of antiseptic. Eliza moved with practiced efficiency, her hands steady as she cut away the boy's blood-stiffened trousers. The wound was in his thigh, ugly and torn. She administered the laudanum, murmuring soft words of comfort as the boy's pained eyes fluttered and closed. All right, Dr. Mallory said, probing the wound gently with his forceps. Let's see what devilry we have here. Eliza held the lantern high, its yellow light making the scene stark and grim. The doctor worked with a quiet intensity, his breath fogging slightly in the cooling air. After a moment, there was a soft clink as his forceps found their prize. He withdrew the instrument, holding up a misshapen piece of lead. He dropped it into a clean metal dish, and Eliza leaned closer. It was a Winchester slug. Common enough, but something was wrong with it. The tip was mangled, not from impact, but by design. It had been crudely clipped, scored with a knife to make it expand and tear a wider, more devastating path. Vicious, Dr. Mallory muttered, wiping his hands. Designed to cripple, not just to stop. Eliza stared at the bullet. A memory surfaced. cold and clear. A few months back, a drunken guard from Crowther's smelter had shot his own foot off while cleaning his rifle. When Eliza had removed the slug, it had been identical to this one, clipped. She had asked him why he would do such a thing to a perfectly good bullet. The man had laughed, a wet, ugly sound. Mister. Crowther pays a bonus for guards who know how to make an impression, says it keeps thieves from getting any ideas. Her gaze met Dr. Mallory's over the lantern light. He had seen it too. No words were needed. The story the boy's body told was not one of a Lakota ambush. The Lakota used arrows, sometimes old trade muskets. They did not use new Winchesters, and they did not clip their bullets like this. This wound was signed, as clearly as if Silas Crowther had put his own name to it. A white man's hand had guided this violence. The dust of prejudice had a purpose. It was meant to blind. 2 days later, the dust settled, only to be stirred again. The morning was still, the air holding a chill that promised the coming winter. Eliza was sweeping the clinic porch when she saw them. A Lakota man, tall and broad-shouldered, walked toward the clinic. He carried an old woman in his arms as if she weighed nothing. His pace was measured, unhurried, yet filled with a palpable urgency. His face was stoic, his eyes fixed on the clinic door. A worn, deer-bone dagger was sheathed at his belt, its polished surface catching the morning sun. He did not look like a savage. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. He stopped before her, dipping his head in a gesture of respect that seemed to come from a place of deep stillness. "We need the doctor," he said. His voice was low, calm, but laced with an exhaustion that went beyond a long journey. Eliza opened the door without a word, her heart pounding a strange, uneven rhythm. "Bring her in." The man laid the elderly woman gently on the examination table. She was feverish, her breathing ragged. As Dr. Mallory began his examination, Eliza found herself watching the Lakota man. He stood by the wall, silent and watchful, his presence filling the small room. She met his eyes across the space. There was no hostility in his gaze, none of the hatred that now permeated Dusty Creek. Instead, she saw a profound weariness, the look of a man who had been unjustly accused so many times that the anger had burned down to embers of sorrow. It was a look she was beginning to understand. His name, she would learn, was Chaska II Elk. The woman was his grandmother, Winona. They had been working for nearly an hour when the heavy tread of boots sounded on the porch. The door swung open and Sheriff Pike filled the doorway. He was a large man who used his size to intimidate, his gut straining the buttons of his vest. His eyes, small and porcine, immediately locked on Chaska. "Well, well, look what we have here," Pike sneered, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "I've been looking for you. 2 Elk. Got some questions that need answering about a certain convoy." Chaska did not move. His gaze was level, betraying nothing. "I have answered no questions because I have done nothing wrong." "That ain't for you to decide," Pike said, taking a step into the room. His deputies crowded behind him. "You're coming with me." "He is going nowhere." The words came from Eliza's own mouth, sharp and clear. They surprised even her. Sheriff Pike turned, his expression one of disbelief. "What did you say, girl?" Eliza stepped between the sheriff and Chaska, placing herself beside the table where Winona lay. She felt a tremor in her hands but kept her voice steady. "I said, he is going nowhere. This woman is my patient. She is gravely ill with a lung fever. Her condition is fragile. Any shock or distress could kill her." She looked directly at the sheriff, channeling every bit of authority Dr. Mallory had ever shown. "This man is her kinsman and her caregiver. His presence is medically necessary for her stability. To remove him would be to willfully endanger her life. Are you prepared to have this woman's death on your hands, Sheriff?" Pike was momentarily stunned into silence. He looked from Eliza's determined face to the still form of the old Lakota woman, then back to Chaska's impassive expression. He was a bully, not a fool. To cause the death of a sick old woman in the town clinic would be bad form, even for him. "This is a medical station. Sheriff," Dr. Mallory added, his voice dry as bone dust. "Not your jailhouse. We are trying to save a life here. I suggest you conduct your business elsewhere, unless you have a wound that needs tending." The sheriff's face reddened. He glared at Eliza, a look of pure venom in his small eyes. "This isn't over. Hart, and you," he jabbed a finger toward Chaska. "Don't you leave town. I'll be back for you." With a final, frustrated grunt, he turned and stomped out, his deputies trailing behind him like curs. The silence he left behind was heavy. Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her legs felt weak. She turned and her eyes met Chaska's once more. The weariness was still there, but now, mixed with it, was something else. A flicker of surprise, a spark of acknowledgement. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a thank you. It was a recognition, a moment of understanding that passed between two people standing on opposite sides of a widening chasm, who had, for a moment, held the line together. That evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, young Toby was sweeping the dust from the walkway in front of the saloon. He was small for his age, a boy who survived on odd jobs and the kindness of people like May and Eliza. He was good at being invisible. As he worked his broom near the bat-wing doors, he heard voices from inside, low and rough. It was Silas Crowther's men. "Pike is making a mess of it," one voice grumbled. "Should have just grabbed the Indian." "Crowther has a better plan," another voice answered, smug and low. "He says to let him be. Gives us a perfect target. We send the real shipment through with the 7 men, then we plant the decoy. Make it look like 2 Elks bunch hit it again. We'll have the whole town screaming for blood by the next full moon." Toby's hands tightened on the broom handle. 7 men, a decoy. The words meant little to him, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of a trap being set, a rope being coiled. He finished his sweeping, his mind racing, the chill on the air having nothing to do with the coming night. The air in Dusty Creek grew thin, stretched taut between two opposing beliefs. In the days following the confrontation in the clinic, the town drew a line down its main street, invisible but as real as the ruts from wagon wheels. On one side stood Silas Crowther, a man who promised jobs and security. His smelter a monument to progress. His supporters, men with calloused hands and wives with worried eyes, saw the Lakota as a threat to their precarious livelihoods. They spoke of the convoy massacre in hushed, angry tones in the general store, their gazes sliding past Eliza Hart with a new, hard suspicion. On the other side stood a handful of people who had lived long enough to know the difference between the truth and a convenient story. Dr. Mallory, May from the boarding house, and now Eliza. They were an island in a growing sea of fear. The whispers followed Eliza from the clinic to her small room behind it, the daughter of the Reverend. They murmured, siding with heathens against her own kind. Mrs. Gable, whose piety was as starched as her Sunday collar, stopped Eliza outside the church. Her words were dipped in false concern. "We are praying for you, child," she said. "It must be the grief, making you turn from your father's teachings." Eliza simply nodded, the red dust on her boots a silent reply. Her father had taught her about good and evil, but he had never told her they would be so difficult to tell apart. One afternoon, while gathering wild sage near the edge of town, she saw them. Sheriff Pike and 3 of his men rode out, not toward the canyon where the convoy was attacked, but toward the small, sheltered grove where Chaska's people had made their temporary camp. A cold knot formed in Eliza's stomach. She stayed hidden in the scrub brush, her basket forgotten, and watched. There was no pretext of a lawful search. It was an act of pure menace. Pike and his men tore through the small encampment, kicking over pots and scattering meager supplies. They ripped apart a bison hide that was being tanned, leaving it slashed and useless. Eliza's breath caught in her throat when one of the deputies took a ceremonial bundle of feathers and herbs, a sacred object, and tossed it into a cook fire. The man laughed as it caught, the smoke rising in a foul-smelling plume. It was a violation meant to wound deeper than any bullet, a desecration of a people's soul. Eliza pressed her hand to her mouth, her own spirit aching with the injustice. She stayed until they had gone, leaving behind a scene of petty destruction and profound cruelty. Later that day, Chaska found her. He did not appear suddenly. It was more as if the landscape had produced him. He stood beside a knot of juniper, his horse patient behind him. He had seen the smoke. He knew what had happened. He did not speak of it. Instead, he looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You defended my grandmother," he said. "Now, I will show you what we are defending." They rode out from Dusty Creek, away from the smoke and the whispers, toward the looming shadow of the Black Hills. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the dry grass. He led her to a place where the prairie rose to meet the first rocky inclines of the sacred land. He dismounted and pointed. Eliza looked and saw a series of low mounds, each marked with a simple pile of stones. There were too many of them, and the earth looked fresh. "The fever that took my grandmother is strong this season," he said. "The old and the very young. They cannot fight it." He led her onward, to a ridge overlooking a vast plain. In years past, she knew, this plain would have been black with bison. Now, there were only a few scattered herds, small and nervous, their numbers dwindling as the railroad and the hunters pressed in. They passed a stream that should have been running clear and deep. It was shallow, the water sluggish, the fish floating listlessly on the surface. Chaska pointed to the pale, chemical sheen on the water, a runoff from the mining operations upstream. He knelt and scooped a handful of dusty soil, letting it run through his fingers. "Gold cannot be eaten," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Water is life." As they made their way back along a game trail, Eliza spotted it first, a glint of brass half buried in the dirt. She slid from her horse and picked it up. It was a spent shell casing from a Winchester rifle. On its base was a small, stamped symbol, a stylized C with a crossbar, the mark of the Crowther smelter. Nearby, Chaska knelt, studying the ground. "The hoof prints here are from shod horses," he observed, tracing a distinct crescent shape in the dust. "The shoes are military style, heavy, for carrying weight. These were not the unshod ponies of the Lakota. They were the tracks of a professional freight team. The proof was there, written in the earth, as if the land itself were angry at their discovery." The sky began to change. The blue faded to a bruised purple, and the wind, which had been a constant whisper, rose to a mournful howl. A wall of red dust rose from the plains, a monstrous, churning wave that blotted out the sun. A dust storm, sudden and violent. Chaska grabbed her arm. "We must find shelter," he yelled over the rising roar of the wind. He pulled her toward a jumble of granite boulders that formed a shallow overhang. They huddled together in the small space as the world outside dissolved into a maelstrom of stinging, blinding dust. The noise was deafening, the pressure of the wind immense. It felt as if the sky were trying to scour the flesh from their bones. Eliza pressed a white linen kerchief over her nose and mouth, but the dust was insidious, finding its way into her lungs, her eyes, her very being. They waited. Time seemed to stop, measured only by the intensity of the storm. When a brief lull came, Chaska unstoppered his canteen. He drank, then offered it to her. Eliza hesitated for a moment before taking it, her thirst a burning thing in her throat. The metal was cool against her lips, the water precious. She drank sparingly and handed it back. They shared it this way as the storm raged on, a simple act of trust in a world that had become hostile and alien. When she finally lowered her kerchief, she saw that the fine white linen was stained a deep, earthy brown, the color of the hard reality that had settled over her life. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a world remade in shades of red. The air was still, heavy with the smell of wet dust. As they rode back toward the dim lights of Dusty Creek, Eliza felt a fundamental shift within herself. The last of her father's simple certainty had been stripped away, leaving behind a core of cold, hard resolve. Pity and anger were not enough. She needed proof, something undeniable that would tear through the web of lies Silas Crowther had woven around the town. The opportunity came from an unexpected quarter. Crowther himself, inspecting a new piece of machinery at the smelter, had suffered a minor burn to his forearm. He sent for Dr. Mallory, who, pleading a fatigue he did not feel, sent Eliza in his place. "Go," he had told her, his eyes sharp, "and keep your own eyes open." Eliza walked into Crowther's office, a place of polished wood and expensive leather that felt like a different world from the rest of the town. Crowther sat behind a massive oak desk, his arm resting on a velvet cushion. He was a man accustomed to power, and he treated her with a dismissive condescension that set her teeth on edge. As she cleaned and dressed the burn, her movements were calm and professional, her face a mask of neutrality. He was complaining about the incompetence of his workers when his attention was drawn by a man at the door. Eliza finished tying the bandage, her hands moving with a purpose of their own. Crowther turned to speak with his visitor, his back to her for a precious moment. On his desk, a heavy leather ledger lay open. Eliza's eyes darted to the page. It was a list of names and figures, but one entry, scrawled in a hasty hand at the bottom of the page, leapt out at her. 7 men, gold, midnight, dead man's cut. The words burned themselves into her memory. 7 men. The phrase Toby had overheard. Dead Man's Cut was a treacherous, narrow pass a few miles out of town, a place locals avoided after dark. It was a plan, laid out in plain sight. "Thank you for your service, Miss Hart," Crowther said, turning back to her and tossing a coin on the desk. He did not notice the flush on her cheeks or the fierce light in her eyes. Eliza took the coin, her fingers closing around the cold metal. She murmured her thanks and left the office, her mind no longer on healing, but on the darkness of Dead Man's Cut and the justice that lay hidden there, waiting to be brought into the light. She would not wait for others to act. She would go herself. The moon was a silver coin in the vast, black purse of the night sky, bright enough to cast sharp, skeletal shadows from the rock formations guarding the entrance to Dead Man's Cut. A wind, born in the high, lonely places of the mountains, snaked through the canyon, whispering a story of its own. Eliza Hart heard it as the lament of all the souls who had met their end in this unforgiving landscape. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady, deep silence of the night. Fear was a living thing inside her, cold and coiling, but resolve was a small, hot coal she nurtured with every breath. This was not her world, this place of shadows and secrets, but she had chosen to step into it. She had left a note for Dr. Mallory, a single line about a patient in need, a lie that tasted like ash on her tongue. She led her horse into a small, hidden arroyo, a place Chaska had described to her with a few spare words and a drawing in the dust. And then she waited. Every rustle of a bush, every cry of a night bird, sent a jolt through her. She was a minister's daughter, a healer. She knew the anatomy of the human body, the properties of herbs. She did not know how to be a spy. He emerged from the darkness so quietly that her horse barely flickered an ear. One moment, she was alone. The next, Chaska was there, a solid presence beside her. He took the reins of her horse without a word, his touch gentle but firm. In his other hand, he carried a small, unlit lantern. He handed it to her. "When I signal, light it," he said. "Keep the shield closed on all sides but one. Point the light only at the ground in front of you. Understand?" Eliza nodded, her throat too dry for speech. Her fingers felt clumsy as she took the lantern. They moved forward, 2 ghosts in the moonlight, leading their horses deeper into the cut. Chaska moved with a liquid grace, his eyes constantly scanning the ground, reading a language she could not comprehend. The air grew colder, the canyon walls rising steeply on either side, pressing in. He stopped, holding up a hand. Kneeling, he pointed to a set of tracks in the moon-dusted trail. Eliza brought the lantern closer. Shielding its light with her cloak as he had shown her, she saw hoofprints, but they looked strange, uneven. "They are clever," Chaska murmured, his voice barely disturbing the air. "They have shod the lead horses with shoes that mimic the prints of unshod ponies, a trick to confuse anyone who finds the trail. But the weight is wrong. The horse sinks too deep, and the animal behind it, its shoes are reversed, a clumsy attempt to make it seem they are traveling the other way." He looked up at her, and in the faint, shielded light, she saw a flicker of something like grim respect in his eyes. Silas Crowther was not a simple brute. He was a cunning man. They left the horses and continued on foot, climbing a steep game trail that gave them a high vantage point over the main canyon floor. Below, the trail widened into a small, flat clearing. Chaska motioned for her to get down. They lay flat on a rocky ledge, the cold stone seeping through Eliza's dress. From here, they could see everything. They did not have to wait long. A train of 7 riders and twice as many pack mules emerged from the shadows, moving with a quiet professionalism that spoke of long practice. These were the 7 men. As they entered the clearing, they began to work with a swift, silent efficiency. From one of the mules' packs, they pulled out several large bundles wrapped in deer hide. Eliza watched, her breath held tight in her chest. The men placed the bundles on the ground, then took out knives and began to slash at them, spilling the contents. But what spilled onto the ground was not the warm gleam of gold. It was rock, worthless, heavy rock. Then, one of the men produced several Lakota arrows and broke them, scattering the pieces around the bundles. Another man took out pouches crudely decorated with painted symbols and tossed them onto the pile. The deception was sickeningly clear. This was the stage, and the props were being set. This was what the world would see after the fact, the manufactured proof of a Lakota raid. "The work is sloppy," Chaska whispered, his voice laced with contempt. "The patterns on those pouches have no meaning. They are a child's scribbles. No Lakota would fletch an arrow that way. The real convoy, the one with the gold, would be on a different trail entirely. This was just the bait for the trap." As they watched, the men remounted, preparing to ride on and leave their false scene behind. And then, everything went wrong. A voice echoed from the canyon walls, sharp and commanding. "Hold right there." Eliza's blood turned to ice. From the opposite end of the clearing, another group of riders appeared. At their head was Sheriff Pike, his bulk unmistakable even in the moonlight. For a confusing moment, Eliza thought he was there to stop them, to dispense some form of law, but the men in the clearing showed no alarm. One of them laughed. "Took you long enough." "Pike," the lead rider called out. "We were about to leave you to clean up your own mess." Pike dismounted, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. "I like to be thorough. Gotta make sure the scene is set just right for the morning." It was a performance, all of it. Pike was not the law, he was a co-conspirator. As Pike walked toward the fake bundles, his gaze lifted, sweeping the canyon walls. It was a casual, searching look, but it stopped, frozen, as it passed over their ledge. For a split second, a sliver of moonlight had caught the brass of Eliza's lantern. "There," Pike roared, pointing directly at them. "Up there!" The world erupted in chaos. A gun fired, the shot deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, a bullet whining past Eliza's head and smacking into the rock behind them. Ron Chaska's command cut through her fear. He grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet. They scrambled back from the ledge, away from the gunfire, plunging into a maze of shadowed boulders and loose scree. Below them, shouts and curses echoed as Pike's men tried to find a way up. They ran, their lungs burning, their feet slipping and sliding on the treacherous ground. The wind howled around them, a chorus to the frantic beat of their flight. Chaska led her unerringly through the darkness, his grip on her hand a firm, grounding presence. They reached a steep slope of shale, a cascade of broken rock that offered the only path down the other side of the ridge. "Be careful," he warned. "The rock is loose." He went first, moving with a sure-footedness that defied the terrain. Eliza followed, her skirts tangling around her legs, her city shoes offering no purchase. Halfway down, her foot slipped. A small cascade of rocks skittered away from under her. She cried out as her balance gave way, her arms flailing as she began to fall toward the darkness below. A hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. Chaska, braced against a larger boulder, held her fast, his body straining with the effort of stopping her fall. For a terrifying moment, she dangled, the sheer drop just inches away. "I have you," he said, his voice strained. He pulled, his muscles cording as he hauled her upward. As he dragged her back onto the relative safety of the path, his other hand, the one braced against the rock, slipped. The sharp edge of a piece of granite sliced across his palm. He grunted in pain but did not let her go. He pulled her into the shelter of the boulder, his body shielding hers, until she found her footing. There was no time to think, no time to thank him. The shouts of their pursuers were closer now. They continued their desperate flight, finally reaching the bottom of the slope and plunging into the deep shadows of the forest that ringed the canyon. Only when the sounds of the chase had faded behind them did Chaska finally stop, leaning against the trunk of an ancient pine to catch his breath. Eliza's whole body trembled with adrenaline and exhaustion. She looked at Chaska in the dim light filtering through the trees. His face was grim, his jaw tight with pain. She saw the dark, wet gleam on the hand that had saved her. "You are hurt," she whispered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her linen handkerchief, the one that had been stained by the dust storm. Without thinking, she took his hand. It was a deep, clean cut, bleeding freely, with gentle, practiced motions. She wrapped the cloth tightly around his palm, fashioning a makeshift bandage. His blood, dark in the moonlight, soaked instantly into the fabric, a stark stain against the brown-tinted white. He watched her, his expression unreadable. When she was done, he flexed his fingers. "Thank you," he said simply. "Pike," he continued, his voice low and hard, his eyes focused on something far away. "He killed my younger brother. Years ago, he called it a peacekeeping action. Said my brother was reaching for a weapon. He was 14 years old, and he was holding a fishing spear." Eliza had no words. She could only look at him, her heart aching with a sorrow that was not her own, but which she now shared. The wind sighed through the pines, and for a moment, it sounded like the name of a boy who had died too young. As they stood there, a pack mule, panicked by the gunfire, crashed through the undergrowth nearby. It had broken free from the convoy. One of its packs had been torn open on a branch, and a single, heavy object had fallen to the ground. After the animal had passed, Chaska went to it. It was a small but heavy canvas sack. He opened it. Inside was a single, gleaming bar of gold. He brought it to her. It was heavy in her hand, its surface unnervingly smooth. It felt wrong, tainted. As she turned it over, her fingers traced a strange symbol stamped into its surface. It was not the smelter's mark. It was a pictograph, a shape she did not recognize, like a serpent coiled around a mountain. They took it back to the clinic, entering through the rear door like thieves. They found Dr. Mallory awake, pacing by the window. He took one look at their faces, at the blood on Eliza's dress and the makeshift bandage on Chaska's hand, and ushered them inside without a word. Eliza placed the gold bar on the examination table under the lamplight. It shone with a cold, malevolent beauty. "What is this mark?" she asked. Dr. Mallory leaned closer, his spectacles perched on his nose. He stared at the symbol for a long time, his expression growing darker with every second. His face, when he finally looked up, was a mask of grim revelation. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "I have seen this mark before. In old treaty documents, in the journals of surveyors who were warned to go no further. This is not Dusty Creek gold. This is not from any legal claim. He tapped the symbol with a trembling finger. This gold, he said, was taken from the heart of the Paha Sapa, from the sacred Black Hills. The gold bar lay on the table between them, a solid block of sacrilege. It absorbed the lamplight, giving nothing back. In its cold gleam, Eliza Hart saw the truth of Dusty Creek, a town built not on honest work, but on a foundation of theft and desecration. The knowledge settled in her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Beside her, Chaska stood perfectly still, his bandaged hand a stark reminder of the violence that guarded this secret. The white linen, her linen, was now a map of his blood and her complicity. Dr. Mallory broke the silence, his voice a dry rasp. "They will not stop," he said. "This is proof of a crime far greater than robbery. It is a violation of a treaty. Crowther will do anything to protect this." Chaska picked up the gold bar. Its weight seemed to settle him, to focus his purpose. "I will take this to my people," he said. "It will be safe there. The sheriff will come for me soon. It is better that I am not here when he does." He looked at Eliza, his gaze direct and heavy. "You have seen the truth," he said. "It is a dangerous thing to carry alone in that town. You should come." The invitation was not a question. It was a statement of fact. To stay in Dusty Creek now, with what she knew, was to put a target on her own back. Her place was no longer in the neat, predictable world of her father's church. Her place was with the truth. She nodded once, a single, sharp movement. They left under the cover of a moonless sky. Chaska moved through the darkness as if he were a part of it, leading her on a path that was invisible to her eyes. They did not speak. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, they arrived at the Lakota camp. It was nestled in a hidden valley, sheltered by cottonwoods and the curve of a small, clear-running stream. The lodges were temporary, made of hide and canvas, but they were arranged with a sense of order and community. A few thin trails of smoke rose into the clean morning air. It was a place of quiet life, a world away from the dust and greed of the town. Winona met them at the edge of the camp. She stood straight and tall, her face a web of fine lines that spoke of wisdom and sorrow. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, assessed Eliza with an unnerving intensity. She looked at her grandson, then at the bandaged hand Eliza had tended, and finally at Eliza's face. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she turned and walked toward a small, ceremonial fire. Chaska motioned for Eliza to follow. An older woman brought Winona a simple clay bowl filled with water from the stream. Winona held it up, speaking a few words in the Lakota tongue, her voice soft but resonant. She then took a sip of the water. She held the bowl out to her grandson, and he drank. Finally. She turned to Eliza, her eyes holding no malice, only a profound gravity. She offered the bowl. "This is for a guest who keeps promises," Chaska translated quietly. "For one who does not trespass on the places of our dead." Eliza took the bowl. Her hands trembled slightly. The clay was cool and smooth. She looked into the clear water and saw her own reflection, a pale, serious face surrounded by a world she was only just beginning to understand. She drank. The water was cold and pure, a taste of life itself. It felt like a sacrament, a sealing of a bond far deeper than words. When she handed the bowl back to Winona, the old woman gave a slow, deliberate nod. She was accepted. Life in the camp was a lesson in purpose and economy. Nothing was wasted. Eliza watched as women worked hides with practiced skill, as men repaired tools, as children played quiet games by the stream. She saw that survival was a constant, shared effort. Chaska taught her how to build a fire that gave maximum heat with minimum smoke, using dry buffalo chips that burned clean and slow. He showed her how to read the shapes of the clouds, to see the promise of rain or the threat of wind in their drift and color. Her own skills found a place there. A small boy had developed a fever, his skin hot and dry, his breathing labored. The camp's medicine woman was skilled with herbs, but the fever was strong. Eliza, with Winona's silent permission, knelt by the boy's side. She recognized the signs of a lung infection. She used a cool compress to bring down his temperature and showed his mother how to prop him up to ease his breathing. She crushed willow bark, a remedy she knew both her world and theirs understood, and mixed it with water for him to drink. For 2 days, she barely left his side. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. The boy's mother looked at Eliza, her eyes shining with a gratitude so profound it needed no language. From then on, a quiet trust began to grow. She was no longer just the white woman Chaska had brought with him. She was the one who had helped save a child. In the evenings, she would sit with Winona. The old woman's hands were never still, always busy beating a moccasin or sorting herbs from her large leather medicine bundle, a guide that seemed to hold the memory of her entire people. One night, as the stars glittered with a fierce, cold light, Winona began to speak, her voice the sound of rustling leaves. Chaska sat nearby, translating softly. She spoke of the Great Bison Road, the path the herds had always followed, a path of life that gave the people everything they needed. She said the new iron road of the white man cut across it, breaking the circle, and now the herds were confused and scattered. She spoke of the promise to the mountain, the sacred Paha Sapa. She said the Creator had put spirits in the mountains to guard them, and that the yellow metal they found there was the veins of those spirits. To tear it from the earth, she said, was to bleed the mountain, to break a promise as old as the sun. Eliza listened, the stories weaving themselves into the fabric of her understanding. The conflict was not about land or gold. It was about 2 different ways of seeing the world. One saw a promise to be kept. The other saw a resource to be taken. Later, sitting with Chaska by the stream, the quiet hum of the camp around them, she found herself speaking her own truth. It felt safe to do so here, away from the judging eyes of Dusty Creek. "My father was a man of God," she said, her voice soft. "He saw riches in heaven. The men in town, they see riches in the ground. They are all looking for a treasure of some kind. I do not want gold. I want a house with laughter in it." She had never said the words aloud before. They felt small and fragile in the vastness of the night. Chaska was silent for a long time, watching the starlight glitter on the moving water. "The dream you speak of," he said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. "I remember it. My father's lodge, before the soldiers came, before the treaties were broken. It was small, but it was always filled with the sound of my mother's laughter. That is a good dream, a strong dream." He said nothing more, but a new understanding passed between them, as clear and deep as the water in Winona's ceremonial bowl. Their worlds were different, but their deepest desires were the same. The world of Dusty Creek, however, did not forget. News traveled on the wind, carried by freighters and lone riders. May sent a message through a trapper she trusted. The town was buzzing with talk of Eliza Hart, the preacher's daughter, living in the Lakota camp. The story was twisted into something ugly and shameful. The women of the church sewing circles spoke of her in scandalized whispers. The men in the saloon made coarse jokes. Her reputation, the only currency she had ever possessed, was being spent by others. Dr. Mallory defended her fiercely, his sharp tongue a weapon against the town's hypocrisy. But he was one man against many. The ugliest news came a few days later. Young Toby, his face bruised and his arm in a sling, appeared at the edge of the camp. One of Chaska's sentries brought him in. Eliza gasped when she saw him. "It was Crowther's men," Toby explained, his voice trembling with a mixture of pain and fury. "They caught me leaving Dr. Mallory's. They said I was a spy for the savages. They said this was a warning to anyone who helps you." He looked from Eliza to Chaska, his young eyes filled with a defiant loyalty. "May fixed up my arm, and she gave me this to bring you." He handed a folded piece of paper to Eliza. Her hands shook as she opened it. The note was from May, her handwriting a frantic scrawl. They are bringing in professionals, a team of Pinkerton agents from the east. Crowther is paying them. And worse, Pike has a warrant now. He is telling everyone Chaska murdered the men on that convoy and that you are his accomplice. They are not just trying to scare you anymore. They are coming to hunt you. The news Toby brought was a cold wind, blowing away the last vestiges of hope for a simple resolution. The Pinkerton agents were not like Sheriff Pike's clumsy deputies. They were professional hunters, and their prey was justice itself. Eliza knew she could not stay hidden in the Lakota camp. The fight was not here, in this quiet valley. The fight was in Dusty Creek, in the tangled web of lies that had ensnared the whole town. She left the camp before dawn, with a promise to Chaska that she would be careful, a promise that felt thin and brittle against the enormity of what they faced. She slipped back into town like a shadow, meeting May and Toby in the warm, steamy kitchen of the boarding house. The smell of baking bread and brewing coffee was a comfort, a small pocket of normalcy in a world gone sideways. On the large wooden table where May usually rolled out dough, they spread a map of the county, its surface crisscrossed with trails and property lines. "The 7 men," Eliza said, her voice low. Toby heard them say the name. It was in Crowther's ledger. "It is the key." "But what does it mean?" May asked, tracing a line on the map with her finger. "Just 7 men on horseback. It seems too simple for a man like Crowther." Toby, who had been watching silently, spoke up. "It is not just riders." He fidgeted with a loose thread on his shirt. "I deliver things. I see who talks to who. I see who gets a little extra in their delivery." He pointed to a spot on the map just outside town. "The freight depot. The foreman. A man named Henderson. He always looks the other way when Crowther's personal wagons come through. He is one." May's eyes lit with understanding. "And the blacksmith, Olson. He is the only one who makes those heavy-duty mule shoes, the kind for carrying ore. He would have to be part of it." She made a mark on the map. "That is 2. Slowly, methodically, they pieced it together. It was not a gang of 7 outlaws. It was a network, a conspiracy woven into the very fabric of the town's commerce. The cook who supplied the freight convoys, ensuring the real gold shipment was well fed while the decoys were not. The telegraph operator who could delay or scramble messages about troop movements. The guard at the isolated warehouse where the raw, stolen gold was stored before it went to the smelter. The fast rider who carried messages between the outposts. Henderson, Olson, the cook, the operator, the guard, the rider. That was 6. Who is the 7th? Eliza wondered aloud, staring at the marks on the map. "They are all just workers," May said thoughtfully. "They take orders. There must be one more. A man who gives the orders on the ground when Crowther is not there. Someone with authority." "Sheriff Pike," Eliza breathed. "Of course, he was the 7th man, the one who provided the cover of law for the whole illegal enterprise." The map was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a blueprint of a crime, a picture of a town held hostage by its own greed. Looking at it, at the 7 points of poison spreading from Crowther's smelter, Eliza felt a cold fury replace her fear. She could not fight this with whispers and secrets. She had to face the monster in its lair. She walked to the smelter in the full light of day. The rhythmic, deafening clang of a smith's hammer striking an anvil grew louder with every step, the sound of power being forged. Workers, their face grimy with soot, stopped and stared as she walked past them. A lone, determined figure in a world of fire and iron. She did not stop until she stood in the open doorway of the main foundry, where Silas Crowther himself was overseeing the pouring of a gold ingot. The hammer fell silent. The roar of the furnace seemed to dim. Every eye in the building turned to her. "Mr. Crowther," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying over the sudden quiet, "I need to speak with you." Crowther turned, a look of mild annoyance on his face that quickly curdled into a predatory smile when he saw who it was. "Ah, Miss Hart, the lost lamb returns to the fold. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" He gestured for his men to continue their work, but they hesitated, their attention fixed on the unfolding drama. "I have come to talk about promises," Eliza said, taking a step into the foundry. The heat from the furnace washed over her. "You make promises of jobs and prosperity, but you build that prosperity on broken promises to others, on stolen land and stolen lives." Crowther laughed, a condescending bark. "You have been listening to too many savage ghost stories. My dear, I am a builder. I am the man who is turning this dusty creek into a real town." His power is a hammer, she thought, and everything looks like a nail. But he was wrong. She would not be hammered into submission. "A man's name is all he truly has," she said, thinking of her father. "Your name is becoming associated with theft and murder." Crowther's smile tightened. He walked toward her, his eyes like chips of cold steel. "You are a spirited woman, Eliza, just like your father, though he wasted his spirit on scripture. A name like Hart still carries weight in this town. It stands for piety, for respectability. It is a name that could be very useful." He stopped in front of her, his presence looming. "It occurs to me that both of us could benefit from an alliance. A man with my resources and a woman with your name. A marriage would solidify my position here, silence the gossips, and give you a security you could only dream of. Imagine it, Mrs. Crowther, the First Lady of Dusty Creek." The offer was so grotesque, so deeply cynical, that it took her breath away. He was not offering his hand. He was offering a golden cage, a way to purchase her father's legacy and turn it into another one of his assets. She looked him directly in the eye. "My father's name is not for sale, Mr. Crowther, and neither am I." She turned without another word and walked out, leaving a stunned, simmering silence behind her. While Eliza fought her battle with words, Chaska was fighting a different kind of war. He was tracking the movements of the new Pinkerton agents, his senses alive to the subtle shifts in the landscape. He was near the old wooden bridge that spanned the deepest part of the ravine when they found him. The ambush was professional. 2 men in front, 2 behind. They appeared from the trees, rifles leveled, their movements coordinated. They did not shout or threaten. They simply raised their weapons to fire. Chaska reacted instantly, diving from his horse and rolling behind a cluster of boulders. A bullet tore through the air where he had been a second before. He drew his knife, his only weapon, and prepared to fight a battle he knew he could not win. But he was not alone. From the ridge above the bridge, a sound rose. A high, ululating cry that was both a warning and a war cry. "Winona." She stood there for a moment, a defiant silhouette against the sky. Then, she and 2 other Lakota men who had been with her drove a small herd of spare horses down the steep embankment, sending them stampeding toward the bridge. The Pinkertons were startled, their attention diverted by the sudden chaos of thundering hooves and dust. In that moment of confusion, Chaska moved. He was a blur of motion, disabling one man with a swift, non-lethal blow and disappearing into the dense woods on the far side of the ravine. The diversion had worked, but it had come at a cost. In the scramble, as the agents fired wildly at the distraction, a ricocheting bullet struck the rocky ground near Winona. She lost her footing, tumbling down a short, steep incline. When Eliza returned to the camp hours later, she found a grim scene. Chaska was kneeling beside his grandmother, his face a mask of cold fury. Winona's arm was broken, her face bruised and cut. The injury was not life-threatening, but the violation was profound. He looked up at Eliza, his dark eyes burning with a fire she had never seen before. "They put their hands on an elder," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "They hurt my grandmother. There is no more talk of proof, Eliza. There is no more waiting for the white man's justice. There is only blood." Eliza knelt beside him, her heart aching. She understood his rage. She felt it herself, but she also saw the trap. "If you ride into town seeking revenge," she said, her voice pleading, "you will be everything they say you are. You will prove their lies for them. Silas Crowther will win. We must be smarter than them. We must fight with the truth, not with knives." His jaw was set, his whole body tense with the need for action. "It is my family they harmed, my honor, and it is our future they are trying to steal," she countered, her hand instinctively going to his arm. "Justice needs a voice. Chaska, not another ghost." Their argument was cut short by a sound from the edge of the camp. It was Toby, breathless from running, his face pale with excitement and fear. He clutched a folded piece of paper in his hand. "After you left the smelter, Miss Hart," he gasped. Crowther was so angry he left his office to yell at the foreman. He left the door unlocked. "I just wanted to see. I just took one paper from the top of the stack." He held it out to Eliza. It was a shipping manifest, filled with rows of numbers and symbols. It was clearly in some kind of code. For an hour, the three of them, Eliza, Chaska, and Toby, puzzled over it, until Chaska recognized one of the symbols. "This is not a number," he said, pointing to a recurring mark. "It is a symbol for a location, a place deep in the Black Hills. With that key," the rest of the message began to unfold. They were not just numbers. They were dates, weights, and destinations. The final line of the document was terrifyingly clear, a death sentence for their hopes if they did not act. "Goods, 7, Black Hills. Train next week." A recent rain had washed the world clean. The air, stripped of its usual red grit, smelled of damp earth and sagebrush, a clean, wild perfume. In the late afternoon, a gentle, golden light slanted across a meadow, turning the new grass a vibrant, impossible green. A small herd of horses grazed peacefully, their tails flicking in the quiet air, beneath the vast, spreading branches of an ancient cottonwood tree. Eliza Hart worked in silence. She was redressing the wound on Chaska's palm. The cut, a gift from the sharp rocks of Dead Man's Cut, was healing, but she cleaned it with the meticulous care of a practiced healer. He sat on a fallen log, watching her, his stillness a counterpoint to the gentle efficiency of her movements. The world felt peaceful here, a fragile bubble of calm in the heart of a storm. But they both knew the storm was gathering, and the coded manifest was the thunder rolling in the distance. The quiet was broken by the sound of a lone rider approaching. It was Olson, the blacksmith, a man whose powerful arms she had seen forge iron into tools of creation. Now, he was a tool of a different kind. He stopped his horse a respectful distance away, his face a mixture of embarrassment and resolve. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Mr. Crowther sent me. He wants you to know there's no hard feelings about your visit. He says a woman needs security. He's authorized me to tell you that he'll deed you the old miller's property. Good land, with water rights. All you have to do is convince that man of yours to ride north and keep riding." Eliza finished tying the clean bandage around Chaska's hand. She did not look up. "Tell Mr. Crowther that I am not for sale, and neither is the land." Olson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, then turned his horse and rode away. An hour later, 2 more men came. Henderson, the depot foreman, and the telegraph operator. They were more direct. "Pike has a warrant," Henderson said, his tone businesslike. "And those Pinkerton men, they don't mess around. Crowther wants you safe. He'll arrange for a private rail car, take you east, set you up with a tidy sum. Enough to live like a queen. All you have to do is disappear." The Virgin Lady. The men in town had started calling her, a name that was part mockery of her father's piety and part crude speculation. They saw her as a piece on a game board, something to be moved or captured. "I am not leaving," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. The men exchanged a look, shrugged, and left. The sun was sinking lower, painting the clouds in shades of orange and rose. When the final emissary arrived, it was Sheriff Pike himself, looking out of place in the pristine meadow, his bulk straining his uniform. He did not dismount. He looked down at her from his horse, his face a mask of false sincerity. "Eliza," he said, using her first name with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "I knew your father. He was a good man. He would not want this for you. Living out here with them. It is not right. Silas Crowther is a powerful man, but he is also a forgiving one. He is willing to forget all of this. He has authorized 7 of us, men of standing in this community, to make you a promise." He gestured vaguely back toward the town, as if summoning the ghosts of the offers she had already received. He spoke of land, of money, of safety, of a new life, of a respected name. He laid out the temptations of his world, a world built on the cold, hard logic of gold. Chaska had risen from the log and stood a few paces away, his arms crossed, his presence a silent declaration. He would not interfere. This was her choice to make. Pike's voice droned on, a litany of empty promises. Eliza let him finish. The silence that followed was deep and profound. In that quiet, she felt the entire weight of her life, of her father's legacy, and of the future she now so desperately wanted. She thought of the men who had come to her, their hands figuratively full of treasure. 7 men had laid the wealth of their corrupt world at her feet. She stood up, brushing the grass from her dress. She turned her head slightly, her gaze finding Chaska where he stood under the shelter of the great cottonwood. She looked at his steady eyes, his proud bearing, the simple, honest strength of him. He had offered her nothing but the truth. He had promised her nothing but a partnership in a dangerous fight. Eliza turned back to face the sheriff, her spine straight, her voice ringing with a clarity and power that startled him. 7 men promised gold. Her words hung in the golden air, sharp and clear. She paused, letting the statement settle. Then, her gaze unwavering, she delivered her answer. The Virgin Lady wanted only the Lakota who promised forever. Pike's face, a canvas of smug condescension, contorted into a mask of pure fury. He had not expected this. He had expected tears, or fear, or negotiation. He did not know how to respond to this woman who took their insult and wore it like a crown, who spoke of a promise he could not comprehend. A promise not of gold, but of sweat and water and shared words. A Lakota promise of family, of a life built together. He sputtered, cursed under his breath, and wheeled his horse around, digging in his spurs and galloping away as if fleeing a ghost. In the quiet aftermath, the meadow seemed to exhale. The last of the tension bled out of the air, leaving only the soft light and the sound of the grazing horses. Eliza walked over to Chaska. He looked down at her, a universe of unspoken emotion in his eyes. "A house with laughter in it," she said softly, reminding him of her dream. "That is my gold." "And a road where the dust is not so harsh," he replied, his voice a low murmur. "That is my land." They stood there for a long moment, 2 people from different worlds who had found a common ground in a simple, shared hope. He reached out, not with his bandaged hand, but with his good one, and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. It was a touch of profound reverence. Eliza leaned into his hand, her eyes closing, and then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fire or passion, but it was more powerful than either. It was a kiss of absolute trust, a quiet, solemn sealing of the promise she had just made. It was the taste of rain-washed air and the steadfast strength of a cottonwood tree. It was the feeling of coming home. When they parted, her hands were trembling. She reached up and unfastened a small, simple blue ribbon that was braided into the end of her hair. She took his wounded hand, the one she had just bandaged, and gently tied the ribbon around his wrist, next to the white cloth. A small piece of her, a token of her commitment, now rested against his skin. "We cannot hide any more," she said. "This has to be brought into the light, in front of everyone." On Sunday, he agreed, his gaze following hers toward the distant, hazy outline of Dusty Creek. "In your father's church, we will tell them the truth." They began to walk back toward the hidden valley, a shared purpose settling over them. But as they cleared the meadow, a sound reached them, carried on the evening air. It was a sound of chaos, shouting, the splintering of wood. It came from the direction of the camp. They broke into a run, their hearts pounding with a new, cold fear. They arrived to find the camp in ruins. Lodges were overturned, their contents scattered across the ground. Cooking pots were smashed, hides slashed. A sacred pipe lay broken in the dirt. It was a scene of brutal, senseless violation. The Pinkerton agents had been here. A young Lakota man ran to meet them, his face streaked with dirt and tears. They came from nowhere. He gasped, "They were looking for you. For the gold bar." "We fought, but there were too many." "Where is Winona?" Chaska demanded, his voice tight with dread. The young man looked at the ground, unable to meet his eyes. Sheriff Pike was with them. They could not find the gold, so they took her instead. They said she is a material witness, but they put her in chains. Chaska, they took her to the town jail. They are using her to draw you out. Sunday morning service in Dusty Creek had always been the bedrock of the town's week, a time for repentance and quiet community. But this Sunday, the air in the small wooden church was thick with a different kind of fervor. It was not piety that filled the pews to overflowing. It was fear and anger, stoked to a fever pitch. Silas Crowther stood at the pulpit, a place once occupied by Eliza's father. He was not preaching from the Bible that lay open beside him. He was preaching a sermon of his own devising. He spoke of progress, of the railroad that was coming, of the jobs his smelter provided. His voice, rich and resonant, filled every corner of the church. He was a master of his craft, weaving a narrative of hard-working townsfolk besieged by a savage, ungrateful enemy. He spoke of the convoy, painting a lurid picture of violence. He spoke of the sanctity of their claims, their right to carve a future from this hard land. And with every word, he cast the Lakota as the villains, a dark threat that must be purged for the good of all. For the good of our families, for the future of our children. We must stand together, he declared, his voice rising. We must drive this menace from our lands so that we may work and live in peace. A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. Men nodded, their jaws tight. Women pulled their children closer. He was not just a businessman. He was their champion, their protector. It was into this charged atmosphere that Eliza Hart walked. She appeared in the open doorway at the back of the church, a solitary figure against the bright, unforgiving morning light. A hush fell as every head turned to watch her. She did not hesitate. With her shoulders back and her head held high, she started down the central aisle, her footsteps echoing in the sudden, profound silence. She walked past the faces of people she had known her entire life. She saw suspicion in the eyes of Mrs. Gable, fear in the eyes of the blacksmith's wife, and a cold, hard curiosity in the faces of the miners. She felt the weight of their judgment, the sting of their whispered condemnations. But she also saw May, sitting near the front, who gave her a small, determined nod. And she saw Dr. Mallory standing by the wall, his expression grim but resolute. She was not entirely alone. She stopped at the foot of the pulpit, forcing Silas Crowther to look down at her. His sermon was broken, his momentum shattered. A flicker of pure fury crossed his face before he masked it with a look of paternalistic concern. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "this is hardly the time or the place." "This is the only time, and the only place," she replied, her voice not loud, but carrying a weight that commanded attention. "You speak of jobs, Mr. Crowther, but you have built those jobs on a foundation of lies." From the satchel she carried, she produced the gold bar. In the dim, dusty light of the church, it seemed to suck the warmth from the air, a block of pure, cold avarice. She held it up for all to see. "This is your prosperity," she announced. "But it is not from any legal claim in this county. It was stolen from the sacred lands of the Lakota, from the heart of the Black Hills." A gasp went through the crowd. Crowther's face paled. "It is a lie, a trick." "Is it?" Eliza's gaze swept the pews. "Dr. Mallory, would you please come forward?" The old doctor walked to the front, his steps deliberate. He took the gold bar from Eliza, turning it over in his hands. He pointed to the strange, serpentine symbol stamped into its surface. "I have spent 30 years in this territory," Dr. Mallory said, his voice the clear, steady tone of a man of science. "I have seen this mark before. It is an old tribal marker for a specific location deep within the Paha Sapa, a place forbidden to us by treaty. This gold did not come from any of Crowther's mines. It is stolen property." Before the crowd could fully absorb this, Eliza spoke again, her voice rising with a new urgency. "And he has been stealing it for months, using a network of accomplices to smuggle it out." She pulled the coded manifest from her satchel. "I have here a shipping ledger from Mr. Crowther's own office, detailing the weights and dates of his illegal shipments." "Toby!" she called out. The boy, who had been sitting beside May, stood up, his face pale but his eyes shining with courage. "Toby, please tell them what you know." In a trembling but clear voice, Toby described the 7 points of the network, the secret trails, the warehouse, the blacksmith, the depot foreman. He named the men involved, his words a cascade of truth that washed away Crowther's carefully constructed facade. The church erupted into a confused babble of voices. Crowther, his face a mask of rage, pointed a trembling finger at Eliza. "She is a traitor, a liar. In league with savages, arrest her." Sheriff Pike, who had been standing near the pulpit like a loyal hound, drew his pistol. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide with panic. He leveled the gun at Eliza. It was then that a second figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the church. Chaska had entered as silently as a passing thought. He moved down the aisle with a speed and grace that was breathtaking, not stopping until he stood directly in front of Eliza, his body a shield between her and the sheriff's gun. Pike hesitated, his gun hand wavering. The sight of the Lakota warrior, materializing in the heart of the church, was so unexpected it momentarily paralyzed him. In that frozen moment, another sound shattered the tension, a frantic, clanging peal. May had slipped out a side door and was pulling on the rope for the church bell. It was not the gentle, rhythmic call to worship. It was a wild, desperate alarm, a cry for help, a summons to the entire town. The bell broke the spell. People poured out of the saloon and the general store, drawn by the urgent sound. A group of miners, men who worked their own small claims and owed Crowther nothing, ran toward the church. They saw the scene inside, the standoff, the gun, and their faces hardened. One of Pike's deputies, a burly man named Calloway, made a move toward Chaska. "Do not move. Indian," he snarled. Chaska did not seem to hear him. His focus was on the sheriff. Calloway lunged, reaching for him. Chaska moved in a blur. It was not a punch or a kick. It was a fluid, precise motion, a redirection of Calloway's own momentum. He twisted, using the deputy's arm as a lever. Calloway cried out as his pistol was wrenched from his grasp. He found himself spun around, his arm locked painfully behind his back, his face pressed against the rough wood of a pew. The entire confrontation had taken less than 2 seconds. It was an act of surgical control, not brute force. The miners at the door moved forward, their expressions grim. They stood between Crowther's hired men and the standoff at the pulpit. The town had finally, irrevocably, chosen its sides. Silas Crowther looked at the scene, at his collapsing empire of lies. The mask of the community builder fell away, revealing the raw, desperate greed beneath. "Fools!" he screamed, his voice raw with fury. "You can have this pathetic town. I do not need your approval. I only need that train the gold is leaving tonight, with or without your blessing." His words hung in the air, a confession of his ultimate priority. It was never about jobs or progress. It was only ever about the gold. Just then, a young miner who had run from the rail yard burst through the crowd, his face ashen. The train, he gasped, looking at Eliza and Chaska. It is not just the gold. The sheriff. He took the old Lakota woman from the jail. She is on the train. They have chained her in one of the freight cars. A wave of sickness washed over Eliza. It was not just a theft anymore. It was not just a fight for justice. It was a rescue. Winona was not a witness. She was a hostage, and the train carrying her, and Crowther's stolen fortune, was leaving that night. The storm came without warning, a malevolent ghost sweeping down from the north. It was not the gentle snow of a peaceful winter. It was a blizzard, a furious horizontal assault of wind and ice that scoured the land. The world was reduced to a maelstrom of churning white, and the temperature plummeted. In the heart of this elemental fury, a small, determined group made its way toward the iron railway bridge, their forms bent against the gale, their breath pluming as solid clouds in the frigid air. The bridge was a black skeleton arching over a deep, unseen canyon, its iron frame already collecting a sheath of ice. The wind howled through its trusses, a symphony of mournful, metallic shrieks. This was where Silas Crowther's future was supposed to be secured, and where they would make their stand. Their plan, born of desperation and courage in May's warm kitchen, was now a fragile thing to be executed in the teeth of the storm. They divided into 3 teams, their movements quick and purposeful in the biting cold. 2 of the hardiest miners, men who knew the land as well as their own hands, broke off, disappearing into the white chaos to find and cut the telegraph line, isolating Dusty Creek from the outside world. The main group reached the base of the bridge. Chaska, Eliza, May, Dr. Mallory, and Toby were joined by a half-dozen miners, their faces grim, their hands clutching pickaxes and heavy wrenches that would serve as their weapons. May and the doctor took charge of a small herd of horses, leading them into a sheltered cut near the approach to the bridge. The animals were skittish, their eyes wide with fear of the storm. They were the first part of the trap. Toby, his small frame wrapped in a heavy coat, looked up at the towering bridge, then at Chaska. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. "I can do it," he said, his voice nearly snatched away by the wind. Chaska placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Be the shadow of the rock, little brother," he said, quick and quiet, with a final, determined nod. Toby disappeared under the bridge, a small ghost armed with a heavy wrench. He began the treacherous crawl along the icy support beams, his mission to loosen the heavy bolts on a section of track just as it reached the bridge. The goal was not to send the train plunging into the canyon that would be a massacre, but to create a violent, undeniable fault in the track, one that would force the engineer to slam on his brakes and bring the iron beast to a screeching halt upon the bridge itself. Eliza clutched a small, canvas-wrapped object in her gloved hands. It was a signal flare from Dr. Mallory's medical kit, designed to burn with a brilliant red light in any weather. It was their signal, their single spark of hope in the overwhelming dark. She, Chaska, and the miners positioned themselves on the rocky bluffs overlooking the tracks. They waited, the snow stinging their faces, the cold of physical pain that gnawed at their bones. They heard it before they saw it. A low, rhythmic chugging that grew into a roar, a sound that seemed to challenge the storm itself. Then, a single bright eye cut through the blizzard, the locomotive's headlamp a beacon of relentless, heartless progress. The train was a monster of iron and steam, charging through the night, oblivious to the drama it was about to enter. Now Chaska commanded. Eliza ripped the cover from the flare and struck the igniter. It sputtered for a second, then erupted with a blinding crimson glare, painting the snow-swept landscape in a hellish, bloody light. At the same instant, May and Dr. Mallory drove the panicked horses from their shelter directly onto the tracks in front of the bridge. The engineer, his vision suddenly filled with a terrifying tableau of red light and a chaotic stampede of horses, reacted on pure instinct. The shriek of steel wheels locking on steel rails cut through the howl of the wind. Sparks flew, a shower of incandescent rain in the blizzard. As the train, its momentum slowing but still immense, hit the section of track Toby had sabotaged, There was a violent, jarring lurch. The locomotive bucked like a wounded animal, its drive wheels screaming as they fought for purchase on the icy, misaligned rails. The train did not derail. It shuddered to a halt, the freight cars clanging and groaning behind it, stopping right in the middle of the high iron bridge. Before the last echoes of the screeching metal had faded, Chaska was moving. He leaped from the bluff, landing with a soft thud on the snow-covered roof of a freight car. Behind him, Eliza and the miners scrambled down the embankment, their dark forms converging on the stalled train. On the roof of the car, Chaska moved forward, a phantom against the swirling snow. A figure emerged from the locomotive's cab, climbing onto the tender. It was Sheriff Pike, a heavy revolver in his hand. The fight for the soul of Dusty Creek would happen here, 100 feet above a snowy abyss, in the heart of a winter storm. Pike fired, his shot a flash of orange in the white gloom. Chaska dropped flat, the bullet singing over his head. He did not have a gun. He had a knife, his wits, and a righteous fury that burned hotter than the cold. He rose and charged, not in a straight line, but in a weaving, unpredictable pattern. Pike fired again, wildly, the wind and the slick footing spoiling his aim, while the desperate battle raged on the roof. Eliza and the miners reached the train. They wrenched open the door of a freight car. Inside, Silas Crowther's Pinkerton agents were caught by surprise. The miners, armed with the heavy tools of their trade, poured into the car. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Eliza ran past them, her heart a frantic drum. She knew which car held Winona. She reached the heavy, sliding door and found it bolted from the outside. One of the miners brought a heavy crowbar. With a scream of protesting metal, the lock burst. Eliza slid the heavy door open and peered into the darkness within. Winona was there, chained to a support beam. She was not huddled in fear. She sat upright, her back straight, her expression one of immense, dignified calm, as if she were merely waiting for a temporary inconvenience to pass. Eliza rushed to her side, her fingers fumbling with the cold, heavy links of the chain. "Grandmother," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I have come to take you home." Winona looked at her, and in the dim light, a faint, slow smile touched her lips. Above them, the fight reached its climax. Pike was a large, powerful man, but he was clumsy. Fueled by panic, Chaska was a warrior, his movements fluid and economical. He dodged a wild, swinging blow from the sheriff, used the man's own momentum to spin him around, and disarmed him with the same precise, controlled motion he had used in the church. Pike slipped on the icy roof and fell hard. Chaska was on him in an instant, the point of his deer-bone dagger at the sheriff's throat. For a heartbeat, the ghosts of his murdered brother and his violated grandmother filled Chaska's mind. Vengeance was a hot, sweet temptation. He looked into Pike's terrified, pleading eyes, and he made a choice. He pulled back, sheathing his knife. He took a length of rope from his belt and quickly, expertly, tied the sheriff's hands and feet. 2 miners climbed onto the roof. Chaska looked at them, his face grim in the swirling snow. "He is your prisoner," he said, "and your witness." At the other end of the train, Silas Crowther saw that the battle was lost. His guards were defeated, his prize slipping through his fingers, but he would not leave with nothing. He scrambled into the lead freight car, where small, heavy strong boxes of the most valuable, refined gold were stored. He grabbed one, a box small enough to carry but heavy enough to secure his future. He kicked open the door on the far side of the train and jumped to the ground at the end of the bridge. Freedom was just a few steps away. His path was blocked by a horse and wagon. May sat holding the reins, her face set like granite. Beside her, Dr. Mallory held an old hunting rifle, its long barrel pointed steadily at Crowther's chest. "It is over, Silas," the doctor said, his voice calm and cold. Crowther was trapped, the bridge behind him, the canyon on one side, and his past in front of him. He backed away, his eyes wild, clutching the strongbox to his chest as if it were his only child. His boot heel came down on a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. He slipped, his arms windmilled as he fought for balance. He let out a choked, desperate cry. His free hand scrabbled at the iron railing of the bridge. His fingers finding no purchase, he was falling. In that final, desperate second, his hand, the one that could have grabbed for the railing, instead tightened its grip on the handle of the strongbox. It was his last conscious choice. He chose the gold. The weight of it, the cold, hard anchor of his own greed, was absolute. It pulled him down, over the edge, and he vanished into the white, silent abyss of the canyon, his scream swallowed by the storm. The blizzard broke with the dawn. A fragile, pale light filtered through the thinning snow, revealing a world transformed, hushed and white under a thick blanket of new powder. The iron bridge stood silent, a black scar across the landscape. The stalled train a testament to the night's desperate battle. The journey back to Dusty Creek was a slow, somber procession. The captured Pinkerton agents, disarmed and sullen, were marched alongside Sheriff Pike and his remaining deputies, their hands bound. The miners, their faces etched with cold and exhaustion, walked with a new, quiet authority. They were no longer just workers. They were the arbiters of a new kind of law. The town they returned to was not the same one they had left. The truth, once revealed in the church, had settled over the community like the snow, cold and clarifying. There was no victory parade, no celebration. Instead, there was a quiet, collective reckoning. The names from Crowther's ledgers, the 7 men who had formed the backbone of his conspiracy, were now common knowledge. Olson the blacksmith found his forge suddenly silent, no one coming for repairs. Henderson the depot foreman was met with the stony silence of the rail workers he had once commanded. They were not arrested by any official law. They were ostracized by the community they had betrayed, their guilt a heavier chain than any made of iron. A few days later, a circuit judge arrived, a stern, weather-beaten man named Miller who had seen every kind of trouble the frontier had to offer. There was no courthouse in Dusty Creek fit for a trial of this magnitude, so they held it in the open air, in the wide space between the general store and the boarding house. Rough sawn planks were laid over barrels to create benches for the townspeople, who gathered not as spectators, but as witnesses to the remaking of their world. The remaining Pinkerton agents, hired guns with no loyalty to the town, were tried first. Faced with the testimony of a dozen miners, they offered little defense and were sentenced to be transported to the federal marshal at Fort Laramie. Then, it was Sheriff Pike's turn. He stood before the makeshift court, his hands cuffed, his face pale and puffy. He was no longer a figure of authority. He was just a man, stripped of his power, his crimes laid bare. Judge Miller called Eliza Hart to testify. She walked to the front, the snow crunching softly under her boots. A few months ago, the thought of standing before the entire town would have filled her with a paralyzing fear. But the girl who had worried about whispers and reputations was gone, burned away in the heat of conflict. In her place stood a woman, calm and self-possessed. She spoke clearly, her voice steady in the crisp, cold air. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She presented the facts with the precision she would use to diagnose a sickness. She showed the judge the gold bar, its strange symbol gleaming in the winter sun. She explained the coded manifest, her finger tracing the path of the stolen gold from the sacred lands to the waiting train. She spoke of the ambush at Dead Man's Cut, of the clipped bullets, of the frame-up designed to incite a war. She did not speak of her fear or of the danger. She spoke only of the truth. When she was finished, a deep silence held the crowd. Then, the judge looked at Chaska. "Do you have anything to add to this testimony?" he asked. Chaska stepped forward. He did not look at the judge. He looked at Pike. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, devoid of the burning rage she had seen in him after his grandmother's capture. It was a voice of deep, settled sorrow. "He did not steal only gold," Chaska said. "Years ago, this man, Sheriff Pike, led a raid on a winter camp. He called it a law and order action. He shot and killed a boy who was carrying a spear for ice fishing. He claimed the boy was a threat. The boy was my brother. He was 14 years old. He did not steal just from the earth. He stole a life from my family." A new wave of murmurs went through the crowd. This was an older, darker crime, one that had been buried under years of prejudice and fear. A miner who had been part of that long-ago posse stepped forward, his face ashen. "It is true," the miner said, his voice cracking. "The boy was just a boy. Pike told us to say he drew on us. We were afraid. We kept quiet." The weight of it all, the new crimes and the old, finally broke the sheriff. He did not shout or protest. A shudder went through his large frame. He sagged, his head sinking to his chest, a low, wretched sound escaping his lips. It was the sound of a hollow man finally collapsing in on himself. Justice, Eliza realized, was not always a thunderclap. Sometimes it was a quiet, final surrender. In the days that followed, the town began to heal, to rebuild itself not with new timber and nails, but with new rules and new promises. At a town meeting held in the now cleansed church, the miners proposed the formation of a citizens' council, a body of elected townspeople who would oversee the operations of the smelter and the mines, ensuring that no single person could ever hold so much power again. The vote was unanimous. Dr. Mallory, his voice filled with a weary wisdom, proposed the council's first two laws. First, that a new boundary would be drawn and respected, and that no mining or prospecting of any kind would be permitted within the lands the Lakota held as sacred. Second, that a portion of the profits from all the legal mining claims would be placed in a town fund dedicated to two things the town desperately needed: ensuring a clean, reliable water supply for all, and building a proper schoolhouse for the children. The motion passed with a resounding chorus of ayes. A few days later, a small group of people walked out to the edge of the territory. Chaska and a few other Lakota men carried a newly carved cottonwood post. With them were Dr. Mallory and a handful of the miners. They found the place where the old treaty marker had been torn out, without ceremony, but with a deep, shared sense of purpose. They set the new post deep into the earth. Carved into its surface were simple words in both English and the Lakota tongue. "Do not pass. Sacred ground." Back in town, another team of men, led by Olson, the blacksmith, worked on the iron bridge. They were not just repairing the damage from the train, they were reinforcing the entire structure, adding new safety railings and strengthening the support trusses. The bridge was being made safe not for the passage of stolen gold, but for the passage of people. That evening, as a fragile winter twilight settled over the valley, Eliza was in the Lakota camp, helping to restore the damage from the Pinkertons' raid. Winona, her broken arm now set and held in a clean sling, approached her. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an old tree that had weathered many storms. She held a long, beautifully embroidered strip of cloth in her good hand. She stood before Eliza and held out the cloth. The embroidery was intricate, a swirling, flowing pattern of blue and silver threads that perfectly captured the movement of water in a clear, running stream. Chaska translated his grandmother's words, though Eliza felt she already understood their meaning. "My grandson chose a woman of courage," Winona said, her eyes fixed on Eliza's. "He chose a woman with a strong heart. But strength is not enough to build a home. A home needs water. It needs the thing that gives life, that cleanses, that connects all things." She gently placed the embroidered cloth into Eliza's hands. The texture was rich and soft. "From now on," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, profound authority, "you are the keeper of the water for this family." The spring that followed the winter of reckoning was a season of quiet miracles. The Chinook winds came early, whispering through the pines, and the great blanket of snow receded, revealing a land that felt washed clean, scrubbed down to its honest bones. On a small plot of land just outside of town, a cabin that had once belonged to a lonely trapper began to change. Its windows were washed until they sparkled. A new porch was built from sturdy cottonwood planks, and a small garden was tilled in the rich soil nearby. On the porch, 2 pairs of boots often sat side by side. One pair was large, made of worn bison hide, shaped by miles of walking on the open prairie. The other was smaller, made of sturdy leather, scuffed from the dusty streets of a town and the rocky trails of a canyon. They rested together in the warm sun, a silent testament to a journey shared. From inside the cabin, and from the yard around it, the most common sound was not the wind or the birds, but the bright, carefree sound of laughter. Toby, now living with May but spending most of his waking hours at the cabin, had rediscovered the simple joy of being a boy. His laughter, joined by that of the miners' children who were now welcome visitors, was the sound of a promise being fulfilled. One clear, bright afternoon, the 2 communities of Dusty Creek came together. It was not in the church, and not in the Lakota camp, but in the green meadow beneath the ancient cottonwood tree where Eliza had made her choice. There was no preacher and no holy man, only the people themselves, standing as witnesses. Eliza wore a simple blue dress, and Chaska wore a clean linen shirt. Winona stood with them, as did Dr. Mallory and May. The ceremony was one of their own making, a weaving of 2 traditions into a single, strong cord. Winona brought forth a clay bowl filled with water from the newly flowing creek. She offered it to them, and they drank. A shared promise of life. A miner, a man who had stood with them in the church, brought a handful of corn kernels, placing them in their hands as a prayer for a bountiful future. Eliza and Chaska did not exchange rings of gold. They exchanged words, spoken softly but heard by all. They promised not riches or ease, but loyalty and respect. They promised to be the keepers of the water for their family, to build a house where laughter could grow, and to walk the road together, no matter how harsh the dust. It was a promise of forever, made not on metal, but on the living things of the earth. The town itself was being reborn. The church, where the truth had finally broken free, was no longer just a place for Sunday sermons. On weekdays, it became a makeshift schoolhouse. May, her kitchen now a source of nourishment for the whole community's future, cooked hot lunches for the children. Dr. Mallory, his cynicism softened by a renewed sense of purpose, held classes for the adults, teaching the miners how to properly care for trail injuries and illnesses. And in the evenings, by the light of kerosene lamps, Eliza taught many of those same miners how to read and write. The scratch of their chalk on slate, the sound of new worlds opening up. It was not a fairy tale ending. No one believed that all the troubles of the world had been banished forever. The Great Iron Railroad, that symbol of a relentless, encroaching future, was still coming. Its whistle could be heard some days, a faint, lonely cry on the wind, a reminder that there were other towns, other men like Silas Crowther, other promises made on gold. The world outside Dusty Creek had not changed, but Dusty Creek had. It had looked into the abyss of its own greed and had chosen to step back. It had faced its own prejudice and had chosen a different path. It had learned, through fire and ice, that a community is not built on what can be taken from the land, but on what its people are willing to give to one another. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley, Eliza and Chaska stood on the bank of the creek. The snowmelt from the mountains had turned the once shallow trickle into a deep, clear stream that gurgled and sang as it flowed over the rocks. The water was full of life, its surface reflecting the endless, open sky. The red dust that had once choked the town was gone, washed away, settled into the earth. Chaska looked out at the transformed landscape, then down at Eliza, a soft, rare smile touching his lips. "When a house has laughter," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "the dust on the road is not so harsh." Eliza leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. She watched the clear water flow past, endless and renewing, the lifeblood of the land and of her future. "Forever is not a promise made on gold," she replied softly. "It is a promise made on water." Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this tale with more people.